Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on neurodiversity advocacy and anti-ableism in schools and the community. Your presenter today is Jeremy Meservy. Jeremy is a school psychology doctoral student at the University of Utah. Before we jump right in, just want to go over a few key reminders to please remember to mute your sound throughout the whole presentation. If you're comfortable, you can definitely turn on your video or not, up to you. And about 5 to 10 minutes towards the end of the hour, we will be having a question and answer session. So if you have a question you want answered, feel free to drop that in the chat box, or you can wait until the end to ask if you want. But yeah, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jeremy.
Sweet. All right, let me pull up the presentation real quick. Okay, so like Annie was saying, we're going to be talking about engaging in neurodiversity advocacy and anti-ableism today. Just as a little bit of background, I was diagnosed with ADHD in 2017 as an adult, and since that time have spent a lot of effort and energy in researching more about my condition, as well as sort of the issues, including the social issues that surround being neurodiverse in general. Okay, so what is neurodiversity? Essentially, neurodiversity refers to the wide range in kind of neurological profiles and cognitive abilities that we see in the human population. And this would include everyone and all abilities as they relate to our neurology. It's kind of the idea that differences in neurological function are more the result of normal variation in the human genome rather than specific pathology. We'll talk more about that in a sec. So this would include variations when it comes to preferences or personality, learning styles, which, you know, we're all probably likely familiar with differences in like personality, right? And we don't view necessarily some types of personalities as superior or inferior than others. But it would also include things such as like social interaction or communication styles, which can be viewed as being inferior or superior, and also sensory experiences, cognition, emotional experiences. And so it's hard to talk about neurodiversity without reference to the kind of paradigm, the advocacy paradigm that accompanies it. And so basically, when it comes to neurodiversity, the paradigm greatly emphasizes the value and importance of these neurocognitive differences, and kind of champions the idea that certain neurological standards should not be imposed on other people for the sake of typicality itself. Or in other words, just because some sort of neurological function or trait seems to be typical does not make it inherently superior than other traits that we see. This paradigm also recognizes that people are subject to power inequities for a variety of different categories, including neurodiversity, and that discrimination on the basis of particular neurological profiles and ability happens. And then it encourages equality, accommodation, and self-advocacy. All right, so there's gonna be a lot of terms here, so I'm gonna try to get through them, but neurodiversity needs to be distinguished from neurodivergence, which would be the divergence of those neurocognitive profiles from the norm, right? And so neurodiversity would, like I said before, it includes everyone, right? It's a category, or it's a description of the group of humans right? It's a broad concept that is just trying to describe the trend that we see in neurological variation, and it's not category specific. This is as opposed to neurodivergence, which typically is understood with reference to specific groups, also known as neurominorities. These would be, well, I guess I'll talk about that in a second. It's defined based on a sort of deficit model, usually from a normative or neurotypical standard, and they are category specific. So they're kind of considered to be in these different categories, which I will explain right now. Okay, so within the neurodiversity movement as a whole, there are a lot of perspectives and kind of unique opinions about these issues in general. One being, who would be considered to represent like a neurodivergent person? And there, like I said, there's tons of ideas about this. Some very common inclusions are autistic people, people with ADHD, people with learning disorders, OCD, Tourette syndrome, intellectual disability, epilepsy. These are just a few. There are many, many that can be considered part of what would be considered neurodivergent. And essentially any group that has distinct kind of neurocognitive profiles from the norm could definitely be considered part or neurodivergent in that way. So the neurodivergent rights movement, just some history here, involves, or it started in kind of the early 90s. It came out of the autism rights movement, which itself was kind of a coming out of the like larger just disabilities rights movements. The concepts and theoretical kind of ideas that supported and eventually grew into what we now know as the neurodiversity paradigm were largely laid out by these early autistic self-advocates who were trying to argue that a lot of the typical models and practices within the autistic community aren't actually helpful, or in some ways are very problematic. And so one example of this is Jim Sinclair, who was an autistic self-advocate who engaged in a lot of autism advocacy back in the 90s. He had a famous speech called "Don't Mourn for Us," which I would recommend anyone to read. It's a great piece that kind of gets you thinking about things. But one notable idea in there is that it's not possible to separate the person from the autism, and so kind of expanding on that to include the other neurodivergent communities, it gets hard to kind of understand identity when it comes to neurodivergence, and especially in relation to like treatment and cures and the ways that we typically think about talking about it. So anyway, we'll talk about that later as well. The point is that there was a lot of advocacy work going on in the 90s that that kind of evolved into what we now know as neurodiversity, which was coined by an Australian sociologist actually named Judy Singer. In 1999, she had a master's thesis that she wrote talking about some of these social issues surrounding neurodivergent communities. And since that time, a lot of online advocacy groups have really caught on to that term, and it's since expanded to include pretty much any other disability category that can kind of or be framed in this neurodivergent framework. Also, yeah, the rainbow infinity symbol you see right here is sometimes used to represent the neurodivergent community. And I think this might be a good time to make this point. Because the neurodivergent rights movement came out of the autism rights movement, a lot of the I guess resources and existing kind of dialogue within the neurodiversity movement still does largely revolve around the autistic community. And so, especially, well, you'll see throughout this presentation, even with some of the resources and research that I present, it is very focused on the autism community at times. But I feel like what we're talking about can definitely apply to a lot of these other categories as well. Anyway, yeah. So the rainbow infinity symbol, it's interesting. As I was doing research for this presentation, there are a lot of things that are hard for me to confirm or not, because this is such a grassroots movement in a lot of ways. So a lot of the dialogue and the kind of advocacy work itself is not coming from the academic or medical community. It's coming from the people themselves. And so in that way, it's kind of hard to, there's no like academic, I guess, measures of how valid some certain points are, or, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And let me go back. And so in that way, I was finding myself struggling to kind of get resources that I knew for sure had a lot of, I guess, authority behind them. I didn't recognize a lot of the names that I was looking into because a lot of times they're the advocacy work that has kind of bolstered the neurodiversity movement is coming from a lot of just like blogs, you know, written by people with real experiences with these things, that then catch on to the community as a whole and become kind of representative of the social movement. And that symbol is one of them. I have seen that symbol be represented or used to represent the neurodivergent community, but I've also seen it as a specific replacement for the kind of symbol for the autism community of a puzzle piece. So I'm making that point just because if you see that and someone is saying that's just for the autism community, could be. I think there's some differing perspectives there. All right, anyway. Okay. All right, some important things to understand about this movement is that there's no centralized leadership. Even the organizations that are most popular within the neurodiversity movement typically tend to disagree on some key issues, and so there's quite a large variety of perspectives and different opinions and ideas within the movement itself. In this presentation, I'm going to try to present the like basics and like a few of the different perspectives. But yeah, it's important to recognize that there's no single perspective when it comes to a lot of these issues. And then, like I said, it's largely grassroots, kind of coming out of this fact that it's typically dialectically opposed to the more traditional medical or academic models of disability, or these, or like autism or ADHD or any of these categories. And so, yeah, academia has kind of lagged behind a little bit, but we are seeing a lot more inclusion of these kinds of terms and issues being considered now in both the professional sphere and in academia, which I think is really cool. Anyway, common aims of the movement, though, for the most part, include shifting mainstream perceptions of marginalized neurominorities from a sort of negative connotation to an appreciative and often cases celebratory perception, where these differences are viewed less as problems only and more as like unique traits that give these people their own unique sense of identity. It also strives to replace the negative kind of deficit-based stereotypes around these communities with more balanced views and understandings of their gifts, needs, and experiences. They strive to create more resources and kind of evidence-based practices that are in line with the community's goals, rather than specifically kind of neurotypical expectations or goals for the community, without the kind of input from the communities themselves. And then lastly, the movement is trying to show that a lot of these neurocognitive differences that have typically just been seen as disability can often involve a lot of really awesome, good things that, you know, are super cool and can benefit society generally. And in fact, have benefited society generally. All right. Okay, so sorry about that. Okay. All right, so in order to kind of like get a grip on how to engage in advocacy and specifically anti-ableist practices, it's important to understand more about what ableism looks like within the neurodivergent community. So we're going to go into that a little bit. So broadly speaking, ableism is the kind of, it's discrimination or belief that people with disabilities are inherently inferior to people without disabilities. It's a preference for non-disabled people, and typically a lack of, or I guess a prioritization of non-disabled, normative, or neurotypical ways of doing things and standards for people. And so in the context of neurodiversity, ableism can often look like things like failure to consider the necessary resources and equitable kind of access and inclusion that people with a lot of these neurodivergent qualities would require to kind of keep up with the neurotypical centric framework of a lot of our institutions. It could also, you know, look like demeaning language. I think this is pretty similar to a lot of kind of ableist or just prejudiced practices in general. Infantilizing, I think, is a big one in this particular community. And I think it's important to note here as well that this can also look like, and maybe I should preface this by saying that, like, a lot of things that the neurodivergent community finds problematic are things that a lot of neurotypical people have tried to actually use or do to support the neurodivergent community. But they do it in ways that are either misguided or kind of don't understand the nuances underneath a lot of these issues. So, for instance, with infantilizing, one way that I know this occurs is through kind of like videos that are meant to be inspiring, the kind of like inspirational quotes or pieces of media that are based around neurodivergent people succeeding in some way that was unexpected, or doing something that yeah, I guess people didn't think that they would be able to do, or like succeeding in just some ways. Even though that is oftentimes, that practice is meant to be inspiring, right? It's meant to be a source of support for neurodivergent people. It can often come off as you know, almost condescending, or like I guess infantilizing in some ways, kind of focusing on the disability rather than the person as a nuanced whole, full of like many different strengths and weaknesses. Anyway, we can move on. All right, so engaging in harmful stereotypes is obviously problematic when it comes to interacting with neurodivergent populations. And I feel like there's kind of like two layers of this. On the one hand, you have kind of like pop culture stereotypes, like ADHD, for instance, being stereotyped as like the sort of oh, like, look, a squirrel, or like just stuff like that, kind of framing ADHD as only the hyperactive, particularly actually male presentation of ADHD, like Kara and Ashley were discussing in a awesome presentation a few weeks ago. And then there's the kind of like, I guess, deeper layer of stereotypes that is a little more, it's a little harder to kind of catch ourselves on, especially as mental health practitioners, because in some ways we kind of develop these sort of stereotypes around these populations based on our own experiences, as well as the research, right? As well as the DSM. And of course, I'm not saying that the DSM criteria are harmful stereotypes, but it's important to recognize that within each of these populations, there's a lot of variation, and there's a lot of kind of nuance that is not captured in the kind of models that we can sometimes learn about in our practices. And so, not limiting ourselves to just the DSM criteria. Anyway, yeah, I'll talk about that more as well later. Okay, so having expectations of neurodivergent people that's based on typicality alone is another example of ableism within the neurodivergent population. And this will often look like having goals for neurodivergent clients that's my dog, sorry about that. Having goals for neurodivergent clients that are not based on quality of life improvements or client driven goals, but rather a sort of expectation of typicality for typicality's sake. So one example might be when I was working as an RBT in an ABA clinic that worked with adolescents with autism. I know that one of the goals that we had was to help one of our clients listen to more age-appropriate music. He was a 16-year-old adolescent who really enjoyed listening to like music from like Blue's Clues or some of these like little kid shows, you know. And so in that case, even though he didn't request that goal, right? That was a goal that was given to us by his parents. But the goal itself, kind of like that expectation to listen to music that other same-aged peers typically listen to, does nothing to increase his quality of life. In fact, it actually went into kind of dropping it a little bit as you know, first of all, we're kind of trying to take him away from something that he like genuinely likes, and second of all, and it's a, you know, it's a new nuanced situation, but he particularly struggled with some self-injurious behavior that we later came to kind of understand was based around so much kind of like prompting and goals and this kind of overstimulation from all these things that we were trying to do. You know, kind of like juxtaposing that with the benefits that he would get from that goal, it makes it really obvious that like that's probably, you know, definitely not something that needs to happen. Okay, let's move on. Failure to presume competence, respect self-determination, or bodily autonomy. This is a hard one because, like I was saying before, there's so much variety in the neurodivergent populations that we could work with, including in verbal ability or you know, intelligence. And so when people can't speak for themselves, it's sometimes very easy to kind of just automatically assume incompetence, or like that they can't decide or make decisions for themselves. And that, obviously there are for sure some situations in which they literally don't have the understanding of some of the situations that you know, need to be dealt with. But for the most part, it's so important to whether you think there's intelligent ability or, you know, like competence or not, to always treat the person as if they're, you know, competent, by respecting their own wishes and kind of their own perspectives. Okay, striving for a cure. We're going to talk about this a little bit in a little bit as well. And for those who are maybe not used to neurodiversity advocacy, this one might sound kind of like weird. Like this might be the first time that some of you have heard that curing these conditions might be considered ableist. And yeah, we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth in a sec. Okay, failure to recognize and celebrate kind of the strengths and positive aspects that accompany these conditions and kind of profiles. All right. Okay, so a lot of these kind of ableist perspectives and practices branch out of what's called the deficit model of disability, which is contrary to something called the social model of disability, which kind of understands, okay, that was a confusing way to put this. All right, the social model of disability, it posits that the disabling features of a lot of these conditions are largely the result of a sort of environment and person mismatch, rather than like innately or inherently, disabling, right? So it would be, in essence, socially constructed. And the idea behind that would be like, if society were structured, or some institutions were structured, or resources were provided much more commonly in certain situations, these deficits would kind of cease to be in a lot of circumstances. And then on the other side of that coin, if for whatever reason society were structured in a different way, there could be disabilities that a lot of neurotypical people have that are accounted for right now. The neurodiversity movement as a whole largely relies on this social model of disability, even though, like I said, there's a lot of different perspectives, and it's not necessarily as simple as I'm explaining right now. But yes, so the deficit model is kind of the more traditional model. It's the medical model, which holds that neurodivergent features are inherently pathological, right? So that the brain differences are just things that need to be corrected. And so going from that model, there's typically kind of efforts made to try to normalize these traits and these people. Symptom reduction, elimination of these conditions entirely tends to follow along with this model. And the deficit model also often omits talking about advantageous behaviors or positive traits, the qualitative reason behind why certain behaviors occur according to the people who actually experience them, as well as society's role in kind of facilitating the disabling nature of a lot of these traits. Now, okay, before I do this, actually, as practitioners and mental health professionals, including myself, right? We work off of the deficit model of disability, right? We diagnose based on deficits and problems. In fact, according to this model, people wouldn't be autistic unless they had sufficient deficits to affect their life, right? And that is very not the way that a lot of the autistic community would see it, where you could have, to them, you could have a very successful, meaningful, and enjoyable life with autism, right? And maybe you would never need to, I guess, seek professional help, since it's about the neurological profile rather than the deficits necessary. So this being said, I don't want to completely, obviously, throw out, I'm not trying to completely trash the deficit model. I'm kind of just stating a lot of these things to get us thinking about maybe the nuances of these issues. And so I'm going to bring up 3 ways that the deficit model of disability kind of falls short in some ways. One being that it's incomplete in that like I said, it doesn't address a lot of the positive aspects, the strengths, the sort of features in the neurodivergent profiles that we see that that should be celebrated, you know, since it just does focus on the problems. It can sometimes lead to or be inaccurate in that kind of the conceptualization of a lot of these features in terms of failure to meet neurotypical standards can lead to that mischaracterization of, I think, some of these problems. Not problems, sorry, neurological differences. An example of this is an article I read recently was talking about how kind of some recent research in particularly the autism community has kind of generated some discussion around the conceptualization of the social deficits that we typically think are one of the things that define autism. What they were finding was that in a lot of different cases, the social interactions of autistic people with other autistic people seems to be a lot better than autistic people with neurotypical people. And in fact, what they were finding is that maybe it's important to consider a sort of bidirectional nature of these social deficits rather than kind of just assuming that neurotypical communication styles are just the best and, you know, the standard. And so they were, it was a really interesting paper, but they were talking about, neurotypical people oftentimes fail to kind of understand and reciprocate a lot of particularly autistic ways of communication in the same way that a lot of autistic people have a hard time replicating sort of more neurotypical ways of communication. And so, yeah, that's just an interesting little example. And then it can often be harmful. I don't know if, actually, in researching this presentation, I was familiar with what I thought was a study where a classroom teacher told her students that children with brown eyes were just inherently, research had come out to say that they were inherently less intelligent than children with non-brown eyes or like blue or green eyes. And she saw that after the children got that idea, they performed kind of worse, more in line with this self-concept that they were given. And interestingly, she reversed it and she was like, oh, actually, I got it wrong. It's the exact opposite. And again, she found that the children who have this kind of more negative self-concept tended to live up to that self-concept. It was in some ways a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. I realize that that's not a study. That's just, I think, something that a teacher did and then got a PBS special on it, which is interesting. But there has been a lot of research that suggests that having a negative self-concept and view, particularly within these disability categories, can often lead to worse outcomes, including both like self-esteem, academic performance, and quality of life. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that. All right, moving on. Okay, so ableism within academia, it's important to talk about, I feel, because there's historically, I feel like a lot of the kind of misconceptions and current institutional, I guess, views of these disability categories directly stems from academia and research over the years. And there's traditionally been a misalignment between kind of neurotypical centric ideas about disabilities and researchers' kind of conceptualizations and priorities within the research around these communities, and the voices, opinions, and concerns of the communities themselves. And this has been facilitated partially because of a lack of inclusion of neurodivergent individuals within the research process and academia at large. The use of demeaning or derogatory language or concepts is very common, especially in the past, but still to this day, there's a lot of this sort of ableist kind of language or in research. Also, there's a component of kind of just a misunderstanding with a lot of the research and kind of work that's been done around trying to understand this community, just because of communication errors, right? A lot of the neurodivergent community feels that sometimes they are misrepresented by researchers, even though they tried to voice their opinions the best they could. And then the use of these findings and research generally to kind of promote agendas that are completely opposed to the values and goals of the communities themselves. Yeah. So one example of this could be a large. Oh, okay. I gotta speed up. Okay. One particularly concerning area has been the research coming out around the kind of genetic tests of specifically autism, right? And the community has been terrified at this because they recognize that a test like that could lead to parents selecting to not choose to have autistic children, and then kind of just the kind of selection of or the selection of autistic traits to go out of the population, and that is obviously not something that the neurodivergent community feels is good. There's this question of should neurodivergent people exist, right? So, like, should autistic people exist? If there was a cure for autism that completely made individuals neurotypical, should we use it, right? It's a very complicated and nuanced question, and there are a lot of opinions on both camps of that question. And I think, I mean, I don't have an answer for you. I feel like that's way out of the scope of this presentation or what we have time for. But I wanted to introduce that idea just so that you can start thinking about it if you haven't given some thought. For the sake of time, I'm going to try to go through this a little bit more. Okay, I feel like I have to talk about ABA as it relates to ableism a little because there has been a past, or a pretty troubling past when it comes to behavioral work within neurodivergent populations, when it comes specifically as it relates to like the use of aversive practices, electroshock, or this kind of, we want to make neurodivergent people indistinguishable from neurotypical people. These things have had a kind of like lasting negative impact on the community at large. And even though it's gotten a lot better, there are still a lot of concerns, like the one I mentioned, where we are, having these expectations, putting goals that are based on kind of arbitrary neurotypical standards or normative standards. rather than like things that will actually improve the lives of neurodivergent people. And also, I wanted to mention this because a lot of neurodivergent advocacy groups just straight up do not like ABA and are completely opposed to ABA. Often citing the use of like using Scooby snacks on, you know, like little snacks or treats or you know, edibles to coerce people into doing things, right? Aversive practices still exist, not to the same degree that they did back in the day, but you know, the use of punishment at all is a ethically hard question, right? Especially in a population that oftentimes doesn't have the means to communicate and self-advocate, and then you know, arbitrary neurotypical centric standards still. Okay, so now we're going to the neurodiversity advocacy and anti-ableism. I basically have listed just a bunch of like tips, and I can go through them real quick in the time we have left. Okay, so some strategies to engage in neurodivergent advocacy and kind of anti-ableism within the places in which we work and interact with other people include, I think a big one is teaching and fostering self-advocacy. This is a big one because I feel like even in myself, I didn't really understand a lot about these issues and the nuances behind them for a long time. I mean, I feel like I have only recently gotten more familiar with advocacy issues, but they've, you know, they're very helpful in a lot of different ways, including that self-concept component that we were talking about before. And so when students that you work with are diagnosed, or you're working, you know, you're just working with them in general, there's a good chance that they are not aware of a lot of these issues, a lot of these resources, and you know, it's good to make them aware of that. Okay, so another thing is learning about neurodivergent experiences, not just like sort of the deficit symptomology that we typically use. One example of this is how recently we've been coming to understand more about hyperfocus as being a component or phenomena that is seen a lot in ADHD, which by itself kind of makes ADHD, it's a misnomer, right? Since it's not as much complete attention deficit as it is more attention selectivity. Okay. It's important to recognize and be mindful of the variety within neurodivergent categories and just people in general, right? Both individually, I think a lot of people have probably heard the phrase like, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. This is the case for, you know, everyone. And then there's that intersectionality component, which, like I said, Kara and Ashley specifically were talking about neurodivergence within female populations, and that was, I definitely recommend anyone who hasn't seen that should go watch that in the university or the UTTEC lab website. Okay, so do research, be mindful of these issues, especially when evaluating the appropriateness of any interventions or goals or resources. I'm going to kind of go through them a little bit more quickly. I've only got like maybe 2 more slides. Become aware of neurotypical centric biases, as well as some of this like internalized ableism that I think everyone just inherently has to a certain degree, like even people in the neurodivergent community. And then try to challenge them, right? Try to be like, why do I think this is better? Like, is there any merit to this? And then don't be afraid to educate others, especially parents and teachers a lot of times, challenging some of these stereotypes. Okay. All All right, I'll go through them very quickly. Understand and be aware of ever-evolving conceptualizations of these conditions. Nothing about us without us is, I think, a great phrase to think about. Just kind of like, yeah, anyway, I'm just going to go fast. Don't focus on deficits. Make deliberate efforts to highlight and understand strengths. Let's see. Promote accessibility and acceptance within institutions. Consider ways to provide safe spaces. And then, explore your own neurodivergence, right? Like I said, neurodiversity encompasses everyone, and to a certain degree, we all are, neurodivergent in some aspects. So like, explore that, like, do you like something that is considered weird, like that doesn't meet the normative standard, or do you engage with, or maybe you don't, maybe you want to, but you don't engage with something because it's weird, in what ways is your inner life unique? Okay, so real quick, last slide, or second last slide, just a few resources. Like I said before, a lot of the advocacy resources that exist are specifically focused on autism, but I think a lot of them can apply to a lot of different categories. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network is a great resource. It has tons of tools and like informational resources for neurodivergent people. And yes, anyway, those are good things. In conclusion, no matter where we lie on this massive spectrum of neurodiversity, we can always discover ways to relate and foster understanding and connection with others. Thank you for coming to the presentation. I guess we can open it up for questions.
Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, like Jeremy said, now is the question and answer session of the presentation. So if you have a question, feel free to use the chat box, or if you're brave, you can turn on your video and just jump right in.
Okay, I'm gonna go back to, let's see. Well, there's no questions in the chat, so maybe no one has questions.
Just for curiosity,
yeah.
Great presentation, Jeremy, by the way.
Thanks.
And thank you for, discussing, especially bringing up, the medical model, deficit model, and, weighing that with the social model of disability. I'm in the Department of Special Ed, and so, we struggle with some of these issues with disability rights and paternalism when you're bringing up infantilization and kind of that paternalistic learned helplessness. And you brought up an example of the kiddo who was 16 and still listening to really young music. And I'm just wondering if when you have that kind of situation where what are some tips you have for like getting that student more involved in the preference selection process? And because they may have a lot of learned helplessness at that point where their decisions have just been made consistently through their being raised, being in the system, and parents. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts or tips on that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the most important things is, as I mentioned before, kind of like helping both the clients and students understand this kind of neurodiversity paradigm and perspective, as well as a lot of these advocacy resources, so that they can become or strive, or go in the direction of becoming a self-advocate. Also, especially as practitioners and professionals, we have a lot of influence, I feel like, on like parents or like teachers or other caregivers. And so educating them on the nuances of maybe some of the ethics around these issues, where you know, if a parent is like, I want him to listen to age appropriate music, we can have a conversation about that and why that, you know, is not something that maybe we would want to do as practitioners. It wouldn't be in like the realm of what we'd ethically consider. I feel like honestly just having a conversation, because these ideas are so, these like ableist perspectives are so ingrained in society. Sometimes the only thing people need is to realize there's like another perspective, you know.
I had a question. I wanted to get your thoughts on social skills groups with ABA and what your thoughts were on it.
Yeah. So a lot of the neurodiversity advocacy groups also do not like social skills whatsoever. They feel like teaching social skills at all is a human rights violation. I don't. It's like a complicated issue, right? And I think it has to only boil down to the client's specific desires, goals, and you know, understanding of what they want, right? So I don't feel like, personally, I don't feel like social skills programs or deficits, or not, training is inherently problematic unless it's being imposed against, you know, someone's will. Because I feel like based on the concepts and models we were talking about, socializing in particular ways is often based on neurotypical or normative, I guess, standards, and we often impose that on others. Like I was saying with the study that was talking about this bidirectional model of social miscommunication on the part of both neurotypical and autistic people. Social skills groups are almost always entirely how can you act like a neurotypical person, rather than like how can we best foster and understand communication. So it's a complicated question, Keely. I think as with a lot of these issues, it needs to go back to the client specific goals.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. So we are almost at the end of the hour, so that will conclude our presentation for today. Thank you so much for attending and asking questions and participating in the chat. Thank you again, Jeremy, for an amazing presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be published to the UTTEC lab website, which you can access by typing in u-tteclab.com. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and hope you have a great day.